"Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the disposal bin." The young armourer's voice carried that particular brand of patience reserved for the elderly and the confused. He was 23 years old, fresh from technical school, and he had a schedule to keep. The old man standing in front of him, white-haired, slightly stooped, wearing a faded canvas jacket that might have been olive drab once, had been staring at the pile of condemned rifles for nearly 10 minutes. "These weapons are decommissioned. They're going to be cut up tomorrow." The old man didn't move. His eyes, pale blue and watery with age, remained fixed on something in that pile of rusted metal and splintered wood. "That one," he said quietly. "The Garand. Third from the bottom." The armourer sighed. "Sir, that rifle is dead. The barrel's corroded, the action is seized, and frankly it should have been scrapped 20 years ago. Now please—" "1 hour." The old man finally turned to look at him. His face was deeply lined, weathered by 8 decades of sun and wind and something else the young armourer couldn't quite identify. "Give me 1 hour with that rifle. If you believe some things are worth fighting for even when everyone says they're finished, comment "never quit" below and stay with me for this story." His name was Harold Everett Puckett, and he had driven 400 miles to reach this National Guard armory in rural Pennsylvania. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. Not his daughter in Columbus, not the staff at the assisted living facility where he'd been spending his days staring out a window at a parking lot. He'd simply gotten into his 1994 Ford pickup at 4 in the morning, the same truck his wife had begged him to sell before she passed, and he'd driven east through the October darkness with nothing but a thermos of black coffee and a small leather toolkit that hadn't been opened in 30 years. Harold Puckett was 82 years old. His hands shook slightly when he held them out straight. His hearing required aids in both ears, and his right knee had been replaced twice. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes that had once tracked enemy movement across frozen Korean hillsides, those eyes still worked just fine, and they had recognized that rifle the moment he'd walked into the armory's storage facility, back when the young sergeant at the front desk had made the mistake of letting an old man just take a look around at the historical collection. The armourer's name was Specialist Derek Womack, and he was running out of patience. He had 16 rifles to catalogue before lunch, a quarterly inspection report due by 3, and now this elderly civilian who somehow had gotten past the front desk was asking for access to condemned military property. "Sir, I understand you might have some kind of connection to these old rifles, but I cannot authorise—" "Staff Sergeant." The old man said it quietly, but something in his voice made Womack stop. "Excuse me?" "You called me sir. My rank was Staff Sergeant. Puckett, Harold E. Service Number RA134055587. I carried a rifle exactly like that one across the Nakhtong River in August of 1950. He paused. "I was 17 years old. I had lied about my age to enlist." Womack shifted uncomfortably. He had heard stories like this before. Old men who wandered into military facilities with half-remembered tales of wars that had ended before their grandparents were born. Usually they were harmless, sometimes they were confused, occasionally they were simply lonely. "Look, Mr. Puckett, that rifle." The old man pointed a trembling finger at the disposal bin. "Serial number 3677402. It was manufactured by Springfield Armory in February of 1944. It was issued to me at Fort Benning in June of 1950, 6 days before I shipped out to Korea. And it was with me at the Pusan Perimeter, at Incheon, and at the Chosin Reservoir when the temperature dropped to 35 below zero and men froze to death standing up." His voice cracked slightly. "I would like 1 hour to say goodbye." Womack looked at the old man for a long moment. The armory was quiet around them, just the hum of fluorescent lights, and the distant sound of someone drilling in the maintenance bay. He thought about the regulations, about the liability, about the quarterly report waiting on his desk. Then he thought about his own grandfather, who had served in Vietnam and never talked about it except once, at Thanksgiving dinner in 2015, when he'd suddenly started crying into his mashed potatoes and couldn't stop. 1 hour, Womack said finally. "But I'm staying with you the whole time." He walked to the disposal bin and, with some effort, extracted the rifle the old man had identified. It was worse than he'd described. The stock was cracked in 3 places. The metal parts were covered in a film of rust that had eaten deep into the surface. When he pulled back the operating rod, or tried to, it moved perhaps half an inch before seizing completely. "Like I said, Mr. Puckett, this rifle is dead." The old man took the weapon in his hands and something changed in his posture. His shoulders straightened, his chin lifted. For just a moment, Womack caught a glimpse of someone else, a young soldier standing at attention, rifle at present arms, ready for inspection. "No," Harold Puckett said softly, "she's just sleeping." He moved to a nearby workbench and laid the rifle down with the same care a surgeon might show a patient. From inside his jacket he produced the leather toolkit, cracked and worn, but the contents inside still gleamed with careful preservation. A brass punch, a small scraper, several brushes of varying stiffness, a bottle of something that smelled like generations of careful maintenance. "May I have some hot water?" he asked. "And a clean cloth, if you have one." Womack found himself moving without conscious decision, filling a metal basin from the sink in the corner, retrieving a stack of clean shop towels from the supply cabinet. He watched as the old man began to work, his trembling hands suddenly steady, moving with the automatic precision of deeply ingrained muscle memory. Harold started with the metal band that secured the front of the stock, tapping gently with the brass punch until it released. Then the trigger guard, then the trigger housing group, each piece coming free with patient, methodical care. Parts that hadn't moved in decades began to shift under his touch. Rust that had seemed permanent began to flake away under the application of hot water and gentle scraping. Womack watched in silence as the rifle came apart piece by piece, each component laid out on the workbench in a precise pattern that spoke of thousands of repetitions. "They taught us to do this blindfolded," Harold said without looking up. "In basic training, Staff Sergeant Morrison would wake us at 3 in the morning, dump our rifles in a pile, and make us find our own weapon by touch alone. Then disassemble it, clean it, and reassemble it before he finished his cigarette." He picked up the bolt assembly, the heart of the M1 Garand's mechanism, and began working on it with a small brush. I hated him for it at the time, thought he was just being cruel. Then I was lying in a foxhole on the Chosin Perimeter in the middle of the night, and my rifle jammed, and I cleared that malfunction by touch in about 4 seconds, while bullets were cracking over my head. He looked up at Womack, and there was something in his eyes that the young specialist had never seen before. Not in any training film, not in any documentary, not in any conversation with living veterans. It was the look of a man who had been somewhere beyond the edge of human endurance and had somehow found his way back. "Morrison saved my life that night. Him and this rifle." The work continued. Minutes turned into half an hour. Rust gave way to bare metal. Seized parts began to move freely. The cracked stock was carefully cleaned and rubbed with oil that seemed to seep into the wood and bring back something of its original warmth. Womack found himself leaning against the wall, forgotten paperwork abandoned, watching a master craftsman at work. No, not a craftsman. A priest performing a sacred ritual, a musician tuning an instrument, something that went beyond mere mechanical skill into a realm of connection he couldn't quite understand. "You know what the M1 does that no other rifle ever did?" Harold asked, holding up the operating rod and squinting at it in the fluorescent light. "When you fire the last round, it ejects the empty clip with this ping, this distinctive metallic sound. The enemy learned to listen for it. They knew when you were empty, when you were vulnerable." He began reassembling the rifle, parts clicking into place with growing ease. But we learned to use that. We'd carry empty clips in our pockets, throw them against a rock when we wanted the Chinese to charge our position. They'd hear that ping, come running out of cover, and find out we still had 8 rounds waiting for them. He slid the barrel and receiver back into the stock. They stopped falling for it eventually, but those first few weeks, he shook his head, this rifle was smarter than they were. The hour was nearly up when the door to the storage facility opened. Womack straightened instinctively. It was First Sergeant Rivera, the senior enlisted soldier at the armory, a 24-year veteran with 3 combat deployments and a face that looked like it had been carved from particularly unforgiving stone. "Specialist Womack." Rivera's voice carried the particular flatness of a senior NCO who has discovered a subordinate doing something that requires explanation. "Would you like to tell me why there's an unauthorized civilian in my weapons storage facility?" "First Sergeant, I can explain. He asked for an hour." Harold didn't look up from his work. He was adjusting the rear sight now, making tiny movements with a small screwdriver. "The young man was kind enough to give it to me." Rivera's eyes moved to the workbench, to the rifle taking shape under the old man's hands, to the array of tools and the careful pattern of parts. Something flickered in his expression. "What's your name, sir?" "Puckett. Harold Puckett." The old man finished with the sight and held the rifle up, looking down the barrel toward the light. "Staff Sergeant, United States Army, 1950 to 1953, Korean War. Rivera was quiet for a moment. Then he walked closer to the workbench, his combat boots clicking on the concrete floor. That rifle's scheduled for disposal. I know. Harold lowered the weapon and looked at the first sergeant. I was just hoping to see it one more time before it goes. We went through a lot together. Where did you serve? Everywhere they sent me, Pusan Incheon. We were with Task Force McLean at Chosin when the Chinese hit us. He said it quietly, matter-of-factly, as if describing a difficult commute rather than one of the most harrowing battles in American military history. Rivera stood very still. Womack saw something he had never seen before in his first sergeant's face. Something that might have been recognition, or might have been something deeper. Task Force McLean, Rivera said slowly. The Chosin Few. That's what they called us later. At the time, we were just trying to survive. Harold set the rifle down on the workbench. The transformation was remarkable. The weapon that had looked like rusted scrap an hour ago now gleamed with something approaching its original condition. Not perfect, not new, but alive. I lost a lot of friends up there. Good men who deserved to come home. He touched the stock of the rifle gently. This was the last thing some of them ever held. Rivera turned to Womack. Specialist, I want you to go to my office. Top left drawer of my desk. There's a green folder marked Historical Preservation. Bring it to me. First Sergeant, now Specialist. Womack went. When he returned, Rivera was standing at attention next to the workbench. Harold Puckett was standing too, and despite his age, despite his trembling hands and his replaced knee and his hearing aids, he was standing at attention as well. Two soldiers separated by 60 years, connected by something that transcended time and rank and regulation. Mr. Puckett, Rivera said, this armory has a historical preservation program. We're authorized to restore and maintain weapons of significant historical value for educational purposes. He took the folder from Womack and opened it. I'm looking at this rifle, and I'm seeing a weapon that was present at 3 of the most significant engagements of the Korean War. I'm seeing a piece of American military history that was personally maintained by a veteran of the Chosin Reservoir campaign. He pulled out a form and began filling it in. I'm authorizing the transfer of this rifle from disposal status to our historical collection, and I'm appointing you as its official custodian and maintenance advisor. Harold Puckett's eyes filled with tears. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. There's one condition, Rivera continued. Once a month you come back here, you maintain this rifle, and you talk to my soldiers about what it was like, about what you did, about what that rifle meant to the men who carried it. He extended his hand. Do we have a deal, Staff Sergeant? The old man took the first sergeant's hand. We have a deal. But the story doesn't end there, because 3 weeks later Harold Puckett returned to the armory for his first monthly visit, and he didn't come alone. He brought the leather toolkit, he brought a thermos of black coffee, and he brought a single sheet of paper, a request form carefully filled out in his shaky handwriting. He wanted to fire the rifle, just once, just to hear it sing one more time. Rivera looked at the request. He looked at the rifle, now gleaming on its display rack in the armory's small museum room. He looked at the 82-year-old man standing before him with hope in his pale blue eyes. I'll make some calls, he said. 2 weeks later, on a cold November morning, Harold Puckett stood on the armory's outdoor range. He was wearing his old service jacket, the one he'd kept in a cedar chest for 60 years, the one that still fit because he was exactly the same size he'd been when he was 17 years old and lying about his age to serve his country. On his chest were 3 rows of ribbons he'd never shown anyone, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the Korean Service Medal with 4 bronze campaign stars, and a small blue ribbon with white stars that made Rivera's breath catch when he saw it. The Medal of Honor. Womack stood nearby, mouth open. He had looked up Task Force McLean after that first encounter. He had learned about the fighting withdrawal from Chosin, about the 1,500 men who had marched into the frozen mountains and the handful who had marched out. He had learned about the rearguard actions, about the soldiers who had volunteered to stay behind and buy time for their brothers to escape. He had not learned, because Harold Puckett had never told anyone, about the 17-year-old staff sergeant who had single-handedly held a roadblock for 6 hours against an entire Chinese company, who had been shot 3 times and had kept fighting, who had allowed an entire column of wounded Americans to reach safety before finally collapsing in the snow. Rivera called the range to order. The small crowd of soldiers who had gathered fell silent. Harold Puckett raised the M1 Garand to his shoulder. For a moment he was not an 82-year-old man with trembling hands. He was a boy on a frozen hillside surrounded by enemies, armed with nothing but a rifle and the determination to bring his brothers home. He aimed at the target 50 yards away, a simple black circle on white paper, and he fired. The crack of the rifle echoed across the range. The smell of cordite filled the cold November air, and then that sound, that distinctive musical ping as the empty clip ejected from the rifle and spun through the air. Womack would later say it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Harold lowered the rifle. Downrange, the target showed a single hole, dead center. He turned to Rivera, and he was smiling, really smiling, the way a man smiles when he has completed something that matters. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for letting her sing." The rifle was returned to its display case that afternoon, along with a new plaque that told the story of Staff Sergeant Harold E. Puckett and the weapon that had served him through 3 of the Korean War's bloodiest campaigns. The plaque does not mention the Medal of Honor because Harold asked that it not be included. "The rifle's the hero," he said, "not me." Every month, true to his word, Harold Puckett returns to the armory. He maintains the rifle with the same careful attention he showed that first day, and he talks to the young soldiers who gather around him, about Korea, about service, about what it means to care for something so deeply that you drive 400 miles just to say goodbye. The young armourer, Specialist Womack, has requested a permanent transfer to the Historical Preservation Programme. He says he wants to learn how to really maintain these old weapons, not just catalogue them for disposal, but keep them alive for the soldiers who come next. First Sergeant Rivera has started a new tradition at the armoury. Once a year, on the anniversary of the Chosin breakout, they hold a small ceremony. They read the names of the men who didn't come home, and at the end, an honour guard fires a single volley from Harold Puckett's M1 Garand. The rifle sings every time. Some people look at an old weapon and see rust and decay, something ready for the scrap heap. They see age as weakness, wear as worthlessness, silence as surrender. But some things and some people are never truly finished. They're just waiting for someone to recognise what they still have to give. They're waiting for the chance to sing one last time. Harold Puckett is 83 now. His hands still tremble. His knee still aches in the cold. But once a month he drives 400 miles to spend an afternoon with a rifle that everyone else had given up on. A rifle that, like him, turned out to have one more mission left in it. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that age is not weakness, that service never expires, and that sometimes the things everyone else has written off are the things most worth saving.